Welcome, AFSCME friends and family and members, and welcome to our first Facebook Live speaker series event, Ideas at AFSCME. I'm Secretary-Treasurer Elissa McBride, and this is the first in what is going to be a series of Ideas at Work speaker programs. And President Lee Saunders and I are really excited to make this new resource available to you. Whether you're an AFSCME member or an activist or a leader, you play a crucial role in your union as well as in your community. And this is one way that we want to support you in all that you do. We're going to offer new research and really great ideas, and we'll do this in a way that makes it possible for you to participate anytime and anywhere, because we're going to do it online. We're going to explore issues of interest to AFSCME members with cutting-edge speakers and top-notch folks who are willing to come and talk with us. And so I'm really excited to launch the interactive series. And just as a reminder, this is interactive because you can make a comment or ask a question before the session or afterwards through your AFSCME Facebook group. So I encourage you to do that. When you do it, let us know your name and your local union. So today, I'm really excited to welcome Vanessa Williamson for our first Ideas at AFSCME conversation. Vanessa is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and she studies the politics of redistribution of income and wealth with a focus on attitudes about taxation. And she's the author of this new book, Read My Lips: Why Americans Are Proud to Pay Taxes. In the book, she reveals some really surprising and interesting facts about how Americans view taxes. So Vanessa, thank you for kicking off this series with us and making your work available to AFSCME members across the country. Thank you. This is April. It's the month when most of us pay taxes, and tax fairness is an issue that's of really great concern to AFSCME members. So I'm really grateful for your time and your wonderful book, which I am still working my way through, but I have read much of, and it's really well written and wonderful. So thank you for that. You're a political scientist by training. And so what motivated you to write a book about Americans' attitudes towards paying taxes?
So one of the things that really struck me when I was looking at, in an earlier project, I was talking to members of the Tea Party, and I was struck by how frequently people describe themselves as taxpayers. And they say, as a taxpayer, and the end of that sentence was never about taxes. It was always about what government should do, your right to be respected in your community, that you should be represented. So these much deeper things, and I started looking into it, and there just wasn't much work done. Particularly, not just, there wasn't much work done on taxes, period, which is true, but there was a lot of focus on the income tax, which is not the most expensive tax for most Americans. So we didn't know much about sales taxes, we didn't know much about local taxes that people are paying, and how people thought about those things. And so I wanted to do a book that broached those questions, and in particular I wanted to emphasize, as I looked into it, how much people see tax paying as part of being a citizen, as part of being a good member of the community, which seemed like such an important point that was really getting lost.
I noticed in your acknowledgement section where a lot of authors thank their family or their colleagues for help with the book, you thank taxpayers.
Oh.
Why did you do that?
Well, taxpayers have paid for an awful lot of things for me, as they have for anyone else who's lived in this country for any length of time. I went to public schools, drive on public roads, been in public hospitals, I've had my garbage picked up every day. All those things are absolutely critical to the fact that I get to be here today, right? The education I got was a real privilege that Americans get to have. I wish all Americans got one as good as I did, but it was publicly funded, and I think that is something that we forget, how important, and the National Science Foundation has funded my research. There are so many ways that I have benefited from tax dollars, and I think it's easy to forget.
Yeah, it's great to have that made visible, so thank you for that. So what surprised you when you started researching Americans' attitudes towards taxes?
So I think at first I was a little skeptical of this idea that Americans are sort of civically minded about tax paying. There's some survey data, for instance. If you ask Americans, do they agree or disagree, it's every American's civic duty to pay their fair share of taxes. Something like 90+%, something between 90 and 95% of Americans agree. Now that is extremely high levels of agreement on a survey question. I tried to look for comparable levels of agreement, and you have to ask things like whether Elvis is still alive, or like, did we really land on the moon? You know, like questions like that before you get that level of consensus. But I thought, you know, maybe this isn't very deeply held. Maybe it's just easy to sort of agree with a nice sentiment, or disagree. People will also disagree if you say, oh, government wastes a lot of money. So it doesn't matter if you hold back a little on your taxes. Americans disagree with that in overwhelming majorities, right? So, but I thought, you know, maybe this is kind of a weak sentiment that people will say if they're asked, but not something they think about. But when I was doing interviews, I was overwhelmed by how frequently people use their status as taxpayers as evidence of being a good citizen. And it just struck me that this was something that really deserved greater exploration and sort of a greater role in our public discussion of taxation.
What kind of language did people use when they talked about paying taxes?
Well, you know, when people would say, oh, taxpaying is a responsibility, you have to pay your taxes, I'd always follow up. I would always say, oh, well, what kind of responsibility? What other responsibilities are like tax paying? And from my perspective, I mean, I'm a political scientist, so my thought on that was that it was going to be jury duty or mandatory military service, which are the other two major mandatory civic responsibilities. But people said voting all the time, you know, taxation and representation. And, you know, of course, that's striking because voting is not mandatory at all. You will not get in trouble for not voting, whereas you will get in quite a bit of trouble for not paying taxes. So what stuck out for me in those conversations is how people said things like, oh, you know, it's a responsibility to the founding fathers. Well, it's a responsibility to my neighbors. You know, those kinds of sentiments that are much more sentiments you might expect to be associated with a voluntary activity, right? But seem to come from a place of real solidarity with other people and wanting to be the kind of person who helps.
That's great. We're going to come back to the connection between voting and taxes, so don't let me forget that. So if it's true that people really see paying taxes as a civic responsibility, then where does this negative narrative about how Americans hate taxes come from? Because that's, I think, what a lot of people think folks feel about taxation.
So I think that's twofold. One, to be proud of being a taxpayer does not mean you're happy about where your taxes go, right? We can all, you know, attest to that sentiment, at least to some degree, or where you think your taxes go, right? So when you look at government and you feel like it's not responsive, when you look at the government and think that they are not looking out for people like you, people get very upset about their taxes, precisely because they're like, well, this is evidence I'm a, you know, an upstanding member of the community, I'm a citizen, I deserve to be represented, and my government's letting me down. Right, so that's part of it. There's a sense that when elected officials in particular are not listening to the majority of Americans, then people get pretty upset about the fact that they're continuing to have to chip in for this government that's not holding up their side of the bargain. But there's also, I think, and I say this as someone who lives in Washington, D.C., I think there's a real bubble here. I think on a lot of issues, what most Americans think and what legislators do are not very closely related. And we can talk about this on any of a number of issues where Americans are basically in agreement on all kinds of things, like raising the minimum wage, for instance. Overwhelming support to raise the minimum wage in this country. That doesn't mean it's going to happen, because what changes policy in America is not public opinion, it's organized action.
And that is something that we know a lot about in AFSCME. What's one thing that you wish more people understood about our tax system?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things to correct in terms of people's understanding of tax paying is there's a horrible myth, I think, that many people don't pay taxes. You've probably heard this. Some of you may remember some years ago, the 47% Americans don't pay taxes. Mitt Romney said this classically, but it was actually a statistic that comes out of my own organization, the Tax Policy Center. And what the 47% statistic was about is in terms of net federal income taxes paid, 47% of households during the recession had a net zero or negative income tax responsibility. And that's because of important policy decisions that were made on purpose to put in place things like the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit. Those things can reduce your tax responsibilities. We do that on purpose. It raises millions of people out of poverty. But the statistic kind of took on a life of its own, and people came to believe that a lot of people aren't taxpayers. Well, that's just not true, because the income tax is only one tax that people pay. And when you look across all taxes together, lower income people pay about 20% of their income in taxes, middle income people pay about 25% of their income in taxes, the top 20% of earners pay about a third of their income in taxes, and the top 1% and 0.01% pay less. But for the vast majority of the income distribution, the system is somewhat progressive and everyone's paying quite a bit. And the flip side that's really negative, I think, of this idea that taxpaying is a civic responsibility, which is mostly, I think, a pretty great thing that Americans believe, the negative piece is when you imagine that there are people out there who don't pay taxes and therefore don't deserve the rights of representation. And that's just a misunderstanding that I found it quite difficult to contradict, because I think sometimes when people would like to imagine that some people are not a part of our political community, they are unwilling to believe that they are taxpayers.
So this is a really important point that I want to make sure we get to, but I just want to check in on sound because I know we got a lot of people watching online. So do we need to move the mic up for Vanessa?
I can actually project with my own voice. Is that good?
Yeah.
I can do that.
Because this is, I want to make sure that we hit this point about the progressive or maybe what needs to improve in the progressive nature of our tax structure. There we go.
All right, so I'm going to combine that with projection. If it's too loud, raise your hand. Oh, okay. All right, I'm actually quite loud, as it turns out. Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of work to be done here. I think that progressive taxation is extremely popular in America. You might not know that. A majority of Americans think that taxes should be progressive. An even larger majority think taxes need to go up on the rich. Because some percentage of people who support a flat tax, that is the same percentage of taxes for everyone, are supporting it because they think it would raise taxes on rich people. That's not because they're bad at math. It's because they think there's so many loopholes that some people are getting away without paying. So they're like, well, if we had a flat tax that you couldn't get out of, that would actually raise taxes on wealthy people. So yeah, there's overwhelming support in the United States for ensuring that wealthy people are paying their share.
Yeah, well, that's definitely true among AFSCME members. In fact, we've, at our convention, which is our highest decision-making body in the union, we have passed resolutions about wanting to see the tax structure become more progressive and more fair, meaning that people should pay their fair share, and that right now, as you pointed out, the very wealthy are the only ones not pulling their weight, and corporations, in some cases, not pulling their weight. So just to put a finer point on that, here's a couple things that came in through the Facebook groups. One of our members says, I pay my fair share of taxes, but the schools in my community do not receive their fair share of funding. What can be done to level the playing field?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. So a lot of tax decisions are decided locally, which means you actually have a lot of power over those decisions. And so one thing I would recommend thinking about is you have to work at a very local level on these things. A lot of states have tax limitations. I grew up in California, which is a place where there is a very strict limit on tax increases. So it really requires a ton of local organizing to make those changes. But it's also a matter, the role of people who think taxes need to go up to pay for public services has to be to counteract the misinformation that politicians hold about attitudes on this question, right? So there's been a lot of work looking at this. Politicians don't have a very good sense of what their constituents believe. And that is true across a very wide range of issues. And it's partly because of who they talk to, right? So we know that wealthier people, for instance, tend to have a lot more say in government. When political science look at this, we find that if poor and middle class people disagree with rich people on a policy position, it's the rich people whose policy position gets put in place. But more generally, there's just a bias in who reaches out to, say, members of Congress. There's a bias in who reaches out even to local officials, right? So part of the job of people who are trying to counteract some of these narratives has got to be to make their elected officials have a better sense of what their constituents actually want.
Yeah, or we should buy your book for every elected official out there. I know many AFSCME members are the ones who do, among working class and middle class folks, get out to talk to their city council and state legislators and members of Congress. But it's just a reminder that we really have to make our voices heard on this, because it's not just that we're right about the need to increase progressive taxation and make sure that the wealthy and corporations pay their fair share. It's that everybody agrees with us, and we really need to make sure that that message gets across. Here's another comment and question from a member who sent it in through their Facebook group. I read that the majority of very large corporations paid no corporate tax in 2018. I pay my taxes every year and am barely getting by. So how is it fair that profitable corporations pay nothing in taxes?
It is not fair. I have nothing to add to that comment. No, it's just obviously not fair, right? People should be doing their part, and there are, unfortunately, far too many ways for very wealthy people and corporations to not be paying their share. I think it's one of the most fundamental reforms. If I could pick one reform of taxation, it would be to make sure that we don't have an upside-down tax code. And especially at the state and local level, this is something worth looking at. Because state and local taxes tend to be less progressive than the federal income tax, there are states where low-income people are paying a larger percentage than high-income people in all kinds of taxes. So that's sales taxes, which fall especially heavily on low-income people. Payroll taxes fall especially heavily on low-income people, but also things like fees and fines. One of the other real values of getting a solid tax base is that it helps prevent the tendency to rely on fees and fines that otherwise is how some communities have been filling in their budget gaps, right? And fees and fines fall extremely unfairly on low-income people and especially on racial minorities. So one of the, a piece of the fight for a fair tax system is to just move that absolutely unfair and racist burden off of low-income communities.
And what do you mean by fees and fines? Give us an example.
So, I mean, I think that a lot of people have followed a lot of the work looking at the way that certain communities, particularly African-American communities, are over-policed. That is to say that they are not getting the crime-solving help they need, but there's a lot of people on the street, things like stop and frisk in New York City. And one of the side effects of that is that when low-income people are getting pulled over for a tail light, right, that's both a sort of misuse of state power, but it's also a cost, a literal cost, right? And fees and fines are the most regressive taxation we can have because it's typically a straight dollar amount, no matter how much money you have, right? So if you want a flat tax, at least that's a percentage, right? But if you're talking about $50, $100, and that's true if you're making $20,000 a year, or it's true if you're making $2 million a year, that's about as unfair as taxation can be. So when we can switch taxation to actual taxation so that we're not relying on fees and fines, we're doing a huge service to our community. And it's also an economic benefit, because when you pull money out of low-income communities, that's money they're not going to spend. Right? And low-income communities are the communities that spend their money, right? They don't have enough. The money that comes into their income goes straight out into food purchases, it goes on to housing, right? So it's a real value to be able to shift the tax responsibilities up the income spectrum, both because it's fair, but also because it's economically much more efficient.
So anything that is a percentage is going to be more progressive
than a straight amount, and anything that's an increasing percentage, assuming you deal with some of the loophole issues, is going to be a much better approach, a much fairer approach, because it's based on ability to pay.
So one of the things that you talk about in your book is that when people think about taxes, they tend to think primarily or even only of the income tax. But these other kinds of taxes are really more of a burden on low-income and even middle-income folks. So what could we do to make people more aware about how the whole tax system works? That's something that I think members of our union would really want to help get the word out. What would you suggest in terms of how we talk about this to make sure people understand that taxation is about all of these things?
Yeah, so I think that one thing that we can almost always do is describe anyone in this country, citizen, non-citizen, as a taxpayer, because they are. Unless you would really have to be living off the land in some sort of deep woods situation before you're not a taxpayer. There are basically no people who fit that category. So remember to talk about people, all people, as taxpayers. I think when we hear the word taxpayer, we kind of imagine a rich person, but that's not accurate. And so I think that's one thing that we can just change rhetorically. In addition, I think it's worthwhile to look at taxes in your local community and see, for instance, are there taxes on groceries? In some places there are. Well, if you put 7, 8, 9% tax on groceries, what you're saying is you would like the lowest income people to pay in taxes an entire month's worth of grocery benefits, right? That's extremely unfair, right? So think about those local taxes in your community and recognize that if we set them up to be a fairer system locally, a mom who's trying to get by and it has to pay a grocery tax, that's say 8%, you make sure she gets that money back. That's 8% more money that's going to go right into the community. It's going to go right into the grocery stores. It's going to go right into the economy, right? So I think that looking locally is one of the ways to lift up the tax responsibilities of low-income people.
Okay. So let's talk about the connection between taxes and what they pay for. So in other words, public services, which is the role that AFSCME members play in our communities. So what is the connection in terms of attitudes between taxes and the public services that they fund?
Yeah, so the one myth that I want to deal with on the tax side is who pays. On the other side, the how we spend the money, there are huge misconceptions about where tax money goes, right? So I did a poll that I really liked. I've done it a couple of times now. I asked people, what are you glad that tax dollars pay for, and what are you upset that tax dollars pay for? And I looked at it in two dimensions, right? I looked both at popularity, like how often the thing is mentioned in the glad, not upset category, but I also looked at salience. That's to say, how often was it mentioned at all? And I think for this audience, you're going to be very excited to hear that the most popular things across the board are local services, right? Roads and schools come out number one in terms of popularity, but also salience. Those are things about a third of people will mention those items. And then basically all other local services are equally popular, like fire, police, sewers. They're just maybe not mentioned as often. So basically no one thinks we shouldn't pay for sewers, but not everyone remembers that we pay for sewers, right? So local services across the board, extraordinarily popular, some more salient than others. At the very bottom, the least popular things that government does with money are two categories. One is foreign aid, and I can talk a little bit about what people think about foreign aid if you're interested. Basically no one mentions that to say something positive about it. The other category is something I called corporate aid, which is when people talk about bailouts or tax incentives for big corporations, those sort of things. No one ever mentions that to say they're real excited that they're sending their money to GE or whatever it is. So that's the top and the bottom. In the middle are all the things the federal government does. Military spending, quite controversial. Healthcare, often quite controversial. Spending for the poor, by far the most controversial, right? Really divided opinions on it. And in particular, and so within each of those categories, you can pick out specific pieces that are not controversial, right? So military spending is controversial. Looking after your soldiers and veterans, not controversial, right? So there are pieces that there's actually still really widespread agreement on. But one of the things that I found most sort of concerning in the data is that spending on the poor is a category that is deeply controversial. There are huge partisan divides on. But the anger about spending on the poor was really strong, and the support was kind of weak, right? These were open-ended responses. I let people put in whatever they wanted into those glad and upset buckets. But on the glad side, when they talked about spending for the poor, they often wrote things like, I guess I'm glad that we pay for food stamps. It's important that people can eat. Whereas if someone was angry about SNAP, they'd say, the wasted money, like you could see the sort of level of emotion behind it was very strong. And so I think that it's great news that we have this whole set of local services that are, checkbox people think are a great idea. But there are the big things the federal government does, which are often very important things, are hugely partisan now and are hugely controversial. And I'd love to see some progress on pulling out those pieces that we can actually all agree on.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the points you make in your book is that one thing that drives people's antagonism to spending money on programs that they perceive as for the poor is that they think that the poor aren't paying any taxes. So this effort to make sure that it's clear that everybody as a taxpayer will support people being more positive about the spending that needs to take place in order to lift up folks who are mostly working poor in our country who are taking advantage of those programs, many of which AFSCME members help administer in our country. So I love this. You actually say in your book there's high, almost consensus level approval for roads, schools, parks, public safety, and sanitation. I think that's really worth knowing and remembering for our union. So let me turn to your idea about using taxpaying as an opportunity to expand voter registration and thus voter participation, which, as you point out, it's voluntary, but not voting can have some real consequences, as we all know. So tell us more about what could be done to strengthen voter registration through the tax system.
So there are a bunch of ways this could happen. A project I'm really proud of having done just in 2018 was offering voter registration at tax time, which seems pretty obvious. There you are filling out a bunch of forms to the government. One more form, very small form, much less complicated form than your tax form. And we could have updated voter registration annually, right? And this would be a really big deal, especially I think for lower income people who move relatively frequently. An annual update to your voter registration can be really valuable. So I tested this program. I offered voter registration at nonprofit sites that do free tax preparation for low income people. I did it in Dallas and in Cleveland in 2018. And what we found is that we doubled the rate of new voter registrations for people who were previously unregistered. And it was a really great result. So the big plan now that I'm working on, and I would be happy, frankly, and if anyone's interested in working on this project, just email me. I'm very excited about it. The big plan now is to figure out how to turn that from one experiment that happened in 2 cities to something that's happening nationally, right? 150 million households file their taxes every year, right? So if we made sure that all of those people got the little reminder, oh, that's right, I moved, I should be updating my voter registration, I think we could have a real impact on access to the ballot in this country.
That's great. That's a wonderful idea. And I'm surprised that it hasn't gotten more traction. What do you think is preventing it from happening?
Well, I think that, twofold. People keep saying, why don't we do that already? Mm-hmm. And I do not know. It's a good idea, we should just do it. But I think that there's also, unfortunately, and this is as a political scientist an extremely dangerous thing, it is not good for a democracy to be in a place where not everyone wants every citizen to vote. That is toxically bad. It is a thing that has happened in countries that have ceased to be democracies. We are not in that place yet, but I think that it is an extremely bad warning sign that we operate in a system where the legitimacy of the full populace, the full citizenry going to the ballots, going to the polling place is up for question at all. And so to the extent that we can fit voter registration into a process that already has all these checks in it, the tax system, then I think we'd actually benefit tremendously, both from modernizing and sort of making more secure our election process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. So I want to come into a close here, but before I do, I just want to talk for a minute about how to get access to the book and to some of your research. So we were talking before we started the interview about the fact that the book is still only out in hardcover, but one way to get access to it would be to ask your public library to order a copy, or if you are an AFSCME library worker, to put it on the list of books to order for your library so that folks in the community can read. And it's really a wonderful book full of great information and resources that can support the kind of work that we do in our union, and it's really well written also, I will say, which is it makes it a pleasure to read. There's lots of quotes from people that Vanessa interviewed that are really interesting to read. And at the end, I don't know how she did this, but she has like a 4-page overview of how the US tax system works. A very bold and amazing feat to try to do that. It does not explain how to fill out your own taxes, and I will apologize jokingly to the AFSCME members who sent in questions about how to fill out your tax forms. Unfortunately, Vanessa is not able to respond to those questions, but thank you for those who did send in questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. I do want to ask Vanessa, for anyone who doesn't have access to the book, is there a way that people can learn more about your research and find your work online?
Yeah, so I'm at Brookings. So if you look up for Vanessa Williamson at Brookings, you will find my page that has a bunch of my writings. It has my contact information if you'd like to reach out to me, especially if you're interested in the piece about voter registration. I would be more than happy to talk to you about it. And you can see a bunch of my writings there, short articles that are kind of snippets from the book that'll give you a sense of what it's about. I should say one of the things that I really enjoyed about writing the book was ensuring that I was centering the voices of the people I interviewed, right? So there's some statistical data so you can see how often people think something, but it is chock-a-block with quotes from average Americans so that you can not just get the numbers, but also get sort of a feel for how people talk about these issues, and I think that's a really important thing to, sort of inject into public conversation.
And anything you want to say in closing to the public service workers who are listening in through their AFSCME Facebook pages?
Well, I think there is a tremendous opportunity for people who work in local unions to sort of engage in more experimental political projects, right? So if you're interested in seeing, oh, how does this effort that we're going to do locally, how am I going to measure whether it worked? That's actually something that political scientists spend a lot of time thinking about. So if you have an idea of how you want to mobilize in your community, reach out, and I would be more than happy to talk with you more about perhaps some political scientists or others who might help you figure out how to measure the impact of the work that you've been doing.
Well, thank you again for your work. It's great to hear how many Americans take pride in their taxes, how many Americans support the public services that we certainly feel passionate about, and to learn about ways that we can strengthen our message in this area. We certainly are going to keep fighting for tax fairness and to make sure that the wealthy and corporations pay their fair share and that we fund the public services that matter to our communities. So I want to wrap it up by thanking especially the folks who joined us through Facebook groups and who joined the first Ideas at AFSCME Facebook speaker series. And we'll bring more of this kind of conversation and more resources and more ideas to you through this mechanism, through this platform on Facebook Live. So I really encourage you to get active in your Facebook group, whether it's for your work sector or through the AFSCME Women or Next Wave group or another Facebook group. Send your questions in for future speakers and stay tuned for the next Ideas at AFSCME Facebook Live speaker series. Thank you.